Well, hi, y'all. It's a Wednesday night. That must mean this is an amateur radio class. Hi, my name is Gary. Ham radio call sign W4EEY, or in ham speak, Whiskey 4 Echo Echo Yankee. And this is a beginning class for those who might not have their ham radio license yet, but are interested in getting one. Ham radio, is that still a thing? Oh yeah, and it's fun. Putting your own radio station together, whether you're technically oriented or not, it doesn't matter. You can still get there. And then making conversations with other people in the area via wireless radio or around the world via the ionospheric propagation that exists. Ham radio is a lot of fun. We are going to be covering Chapter 2 in our book, and this is the book we use. The American Radio Relay League License Manual for the Technician class, the 5th edition book, this one right here. And if you'd like to follow along, you can get this book. The class is being streamed live on YouTube, and it's free, so anybody can come aboard. We appreciate you very much. We're going to go over Chapter 2 in the book tonight, which is Radio and Signals Fundamentals. And for all of the folks on our mailing lists, both on YouTube and in our Zoom classroom, we have about 15 folks in the Zoom classroom at the moment, I sent an email out asking everyone to read Chapter 2. And especially for those without a technical background who don't have science recently or haven't done mathematics or things like that, well, this is probably what it feels like, that you're jumping off of a cliff or you're diving into the deep end. Let me assure you that feeling is completely normal, that you will feel kind of overwhelmed at first, and that's fine, because as we go along, as we talk about things here in the class, as you do more readings, you're going to have what I call aha moments. You're going to go, oh, that's what he was talking about. It may not be clear now, but it will be by the end of the class. You're going to surprise yourself, I think. So we talked a little bit last week about some other personal radio services in the United States. I'll just refer to some here. The family radio service. Those are the walkie-talkies you can get at Walmart or Target, what have you. The little inexpensive ones you might use on vacation to keep in touch. That's the family radio service. No licenses needed for those. There's the general mobile radio service, which is also a UHF-only radio service, but you do need a license for that. You just have to apply to the FCC and send them $35, and then you can use GMRS radios, which are a little bigger, a little more powerful, can use some external antennas. And then Citizens Band, that's not VHF or UHF, that's 27 megahertz. That's in the upper end of the high frequency band. It used to be you had to have a license, no more. So these are all different kinds of radio services that are available to folks here in the United States. Ham radio, well, we have multiple frequency bands, differing modes, both voice, Morse code, digital modes, slow scan television, all sorts of different things that the others do not. We can have radio repeaters. Our power levels are much higher. We can go up to 1,500 watts. And the ability to build our own equipment to use on the air, which is not possible in any of the other radio services. So that's the underlying reason why in amateur radio and ham radio we do need to kind of cover some of these technical topics that you might otherwise say, I'm not going to do that, Gary. I'm not going to fix my radios. I'm not going to, but to have this background, to have a cadre of people in the amateur radio community who have this common understanding about radio. So that's why we do it. That's why we're doing it here. And you're going to be part of the fraternity here very, very shortly. So section 2.1 is radio signals and waves. And largely it has to do with some measurements and some metrics. We'll talk about that. Here's in our classes, we will highlight things in blue text. And if you see something with blue text, it likely relates to an upcoming test question. So we're going to have a little lecture here, a little talk. Then we're going to go over the test questions from section 2.1 and see if you can retain the information that we talked about. So we're going to go right back to basics. We're going to talk about numbers. And I don't know how old you are, but it's been decades since I went to high school, since I had algebra or any of the other stuff. So, sometimes you need a little review. So we have, whole numbers and fractions. We have decimal numbering. We have shifting by 1,000. We'll talk more about that. There's scientific notation, engineering notation, and then the metric prefixes. So let me move over to the blackboard. I don't know if Bruce knew I was going to do this. I didn't tell him, actually. This is our blackboard. So whole numbers versus fractions. This is pretty easy, here's 1,000. Well, that's a whole number. Or here's 12. That's another whole number. Okay, great. Fractions, 1/4 or 1/2. These don't relate to each other. I'm just randomly putting these out here. Decimal numbering, well, 1/4 can also be expressed as 0.25. You might remember that. That's the same as a quarter. A half is the same as 0.5. So that's decimal numbering. If you're converting to units, let's say we have a very small number, 001, and I want to convert, you can move the decimal point over. We're going to be doing some of that here coming up here in just a little bit. Some of you might remember scientific notation, especially for very big or very small numbers. I mean, we can write 1,000,000 like that. A 1 and 6 zeros. I don't know if the glare is getting the better. So 1 and 6 zeros. But in scientific notation, you would write this as 1 times 10 to the 6th power. And you don't have to know this for the technician class, but I'm introducing this concept to you because as you go ahead in the general class and the extra class, then we will start using this. For some of those of you with a medical background or an electronics or engineering background, this will be, old hat. There's no problem. Engineering notation, by the way, is the same as scientific notation, except it only, the powers of 10 go up by 3s. So 1 times 10 to the 3rd power, 1 times 10 to the 6th power, 1 times 10 to the 9th power. This is the same as 1,000. This is the same as 1,000,000. And this is the same as 1,000,000,000. And so these are different ways of expressing numbers. And the metric system works in that same way as we have words to express how big or how small something is. And we use these metric prefixes in science, and radio is part of physics. So let's talk a little bit more about metric prefixes. And these are the ones, if we go back to the laptop, please. These are the ones that we use, and these are the ones that we need to know about, the ones in yellow. You've got the full list there of the metric system prefixes, and they're also on page 2-2 in your book. But what we are looking at are numbers, let me turn on my laser pointer here. Hang on a second. There we go. So these up here, these are for quantities that are greater than 1. So a kilo, anything, is 10 to the 3rd power, or 1,000. You've heard of kilometers. That's 1,000 meters. We'll look at a meter stick here in just a second. Mega, that's 10 to the 6th power, or that's 1,000,000. And giga is 10 to the 9th power, or a billion. All right, so giga, mega, and kilo, we need to know these. And then for numbers that are smaller than 1, that are fractional, less than 1, we have milli, micro, nano, and pico, although some people say pico. And so milli is 1/1000th, or 10 to the minus 3rd. Micro is 10 to the minus 6th, or 1/1,000,000th. Nano is 1/1000,000,000th, and or I guess that would be 1/1000,000th is probably the way to express that. And then pico is 1/1,000,000,000th, 10 to the minus 12th. Okay, Gary, I'm an American. We don't have the metric system in the United States. We have inches, feet. You take the key out, Bruce. Thank you. My little guy down there in the corner. But there are benefits to the metric system. In our American system, the units don't lend themselves to scientific conversion. There's no consistency between units, inches, feet, miles, pounds, and quarts, whereas the metric system is always based on the number 10. You multiply or divide by 10. It's an international system of units used by all scientists worldwide, and it's used in sciences for measurement. Powers of 10, that's not hard. You're already doing it. You use powers of 10 every day. What I want you to think about is cash. Well, maybe you don't have cash in your wallet anymore. We have plastic. But let me take you to an imaginary country called Garyland. Oh my. And this is the unit of measure of currency in this country. It's called the Gary buck. This is 1 Gary buck. All right. But if we have 1,000 of these, then we could have something called a kilo buck. So let's go over to the calculator cam, Bruce, if you would. Here's our Gary bucks. The Treasury Department is going to get me because I copied the U.S. dollar bill here. But okay, we go down a little bit. Here's 1,000 Gary bucks. This would be the same as 1 kilo buck. A kilo buck. And if we have multiples of them, here's 2 kilobucks, 3 kilobucks, 4 kilobucks. If we go up even further in quantity, whoa, here's a million Gary bucks, or 1 mega buck. This little bill right here is worth 1 million bucks, 1 mega buck. And if we go even, more, we have a billion. Here's a billion, or a gigabuck. I'd like to have that in my wallet and be able to spend it, but I don't think that's going to happen. So those are for numbers that are larger than 1. We can also go in the opposite direction. We can go smaller. I have to put my glasses on for these. But here we have, these are 1/1000th of a Gary buck, or these are a millibuck. All right. Here's 1/1,000,000th of a Gary buck. That's 1 microbuck. If we go down here a little further, here's 1/1,000,000th of a millionth, or a pico buck. So the prefixes that we use from the metric system, come on back over if you want, just help us in a shorthand way to talk about a base unit of something, the Gary buck, for example, or if we then have a larger number of them, then we can convert this to a kilo buck, or a mega buck, or a giga buck, or going smaller, then we can have a millibuck, or a microbuck, or a nanobuck, or a pico buck. These are all different things working off of whatever the base unit is. And in electronics, the base units are going to be voltage, measured in volts, amperage measured in amps, resistance measured in ohms, watts, power measured in watts. And here's another look at those prefixes, but put on a timeline. Some people are able to relate to this. And understanding the relationship between all of these different metric prefixes is important. I just want to assure you that you will get it. It will come clear to you. We're going to do some practice problems here in a little bit, and you'll be surprised how quickly you can get it. And I mentioned the meter stick. Let me just show you here. I'm going to go all the way over to the green screen, because we haven't used the green screen, so I just want to be here. But this is a meter stick, and it's about, in American, about 38 inches long, I think it is. But if you look at the subdivisions in here, the very smallest subdivisions, I don't know how well that'll focus in, I'm out of the light there, are 1/1000th of a meter. So those are the millimeters. The larger divisions are 1/100th of a meter, or 1 centimeter. So that's what the metric system is all about, and we're going to get good in using these metric prefixes. So applaud yourself, because you're understanding some new concepts, and I appreciate it. All right. Let's make some RF waves. This is the calming time after that little stressful episode with the numbers. Think of ripples on a pond. If you were to throw a pebble out into a quiet pond, then you would have waves that would radiate out from the point of excitation in the pond, the point that the pebble went in. And if we were to take a look at these waves on a sideways view, this is we're looking side on to the wave, and so we're looking here as amplitude and time on this scale. So we have peaks, and we have valleys, troughs, and we have peaks again. This perfectly formed wave is called a sine wave, and is generated either mechanically through generators or electronically via oscillators. And the sine wave, one of the characteristics that we can measure is its frequency. How often does it alternate up and down? How many times in a certain period of time does it complete the cycles? And so here are some relative, here's a lower frequency signal. See, it's only happening with 1 or 2 peaks here. Here we've got 3 peaks, so this is a medium frequency, and a higher frequency signal. And we use frequency in amateur radio to determine where we are going to operate, the restrictions that we have, the limits and whatnot. So frequency is important to us. Frequency is the number of complete cycles in 1 second. And just to complete definitions, so we don't use it that often, but period is the number of seconds or milliseconds or microseconds it takes to complete 1 cycle, depending on what the frequency of the device is. So again, we're looking here in the time domain at a graph. We're looking at amplitude on the vertical scale and time on the horizontal scale. So frequency we talk about all the time in radio. Another thing that we talk about is wavelength. And wavelength is the distance a radio wave will travel during the period of 1 complete cycle. And radio waves travel at the speed of light. And again, we're using the metric system, so it's 300 million meters per second. If we stick in the metric system, then a lot of calculations are much easier. We don't want to get into the English system of 186,000 miles per second, because that's not going to work. 300 million meters per second. And so if, for example, our antenna is over here on the left, and we have 1 complete wavelength, and you determine a wavelength by going from a point and then to the next same point as well. So the peaks, they're using the peaks here. This is 1 wavelength. They could have gone from here to here, and the distance would be the same. The thing is, how far does the radio wave travel from the antenna in one wavelength, and the answer will be in meters, and that is known as the wavelength of a signal. So I'm going to go back to me here in the, oh, sorry, I did that to you, Bruce, sorry. These are the color charts, and there's one of these in your book right now, although it's not in color. These are the amateur radio bands in the United States, and they're indicated by the frequency of operation, and they're also indicated by the approximate wavelength of those signals in those bands. And the color chart, we'll give you an opportunity to send to, I'll mail you one of these for free here in just a little bit. But the concepts I'd like you to consider are that frequency is where you tune your radio. Wavelength has to do with how big you build your antenna. And if you can't wait, you can go to this URL at the American Radio Relay League and download the color chart. This very same one, different sizes, they're PDFs, and you can print it out in your own printer, and boom, you'll have one. Or if you would like, please just send me an email at w4eey@arrl.net. Send me your mailing address and say, Gary, I would like one of the color charts. And I'll be happy to put one in the mail to you as well. Now, I just did this for the very first time last night. We taught the extra class, and I made this offer to them as well. But have you bought stamps recently? Somebody said they should call the new stamps the best regards stamps because they're 73 cents for a first class stamp. So if it's in your heart and you'd like to send us a little bit of money as a donation to help defray some of the costs for mailing these charts out, we buy these charts, by the way, from the American Radio Relay League. You can do a super thanks on YouTube, either in the recordings or on the live stream, or at my website, w4eey.com. There's a PayPal donation link. If it's something you'd like to do now or in the future, to send us a little donation to help things on. Classes are always free, but we'll take all the help we can get. So frequency, how often the radio signal goes up and down in 1 second. The frequency is measured in cycles per second, or more commonly now, hertz. Is the name. But back in the day we used to say 1,000 cycles per second, or 1,000 kilocycles per second, or a megacycle. These were indications of frequency, but it changed in the late 1970s. Cycles per second were changed to the scientific abbreviation Hertz to honor this gentleman. This is Heinrich Hertz, a German physicist who was very active in radio. And if you like to go antiquing or looking at old radios or radio equipment, you can date equipment by looking at their dial. And if the dial says kilocycles or megacycles per second, then you know that radio is before the 1970s. Whereas in the 1970s, then they went to the megahertz and kilohertz designations. So, frequency of a radio wave is along a spectrum. Let's say you're in your car, and if you're listening to AM radio, not too many people do that anymore, but okay, let's say you were listening to AM radio. That is in the medium frequency range. And in fact, if you see on this chart, this is 1 megahertz. So this is in the AM broadcast band in the United States. So that's where your AM car radio would be on this spectrum. Whereas if you're listening to FM in the car radio, that's 100 megahertz, and so that's up here in the very high frequency section. So we designate the bands medium frequency, high frequency, very high frequency, ultra high frequency, super high frequency, and extremely high frequency are some of the designations. And there is organization in the amateur radio bands and in the commercial radio bands. The FCC is the organization that's in charge of allocating frequencies to the various radio broadcast services. The FCC is in charge of all civilian telecommunications in the United States. The Department of Defense has their own organization. They're separate. But for amateur radio, for example, we abide by designations from the FCC. And so for us, in this class, these are the 3 bands that we want to know about, that we want to memorize, we want to know what we're talking about. The high frequency bands from 100 to 10 meters, that's the wavelength, 3 to 30 megahertz, that's the frequency range. We call that the high frequency band. Above the high frequency band is the VHF, 30 to 300 megahertz. And above that, from 300 to 3,000 megahertz, is the ultra high frequency range. So high frequency, very high frequency, and ultra high frequency. These are the frequency bands that we are most interested in amateur radio today for this class. Now, I talked about going antiquing. If you do find an old radio like this one, some of the very oldest radios had both frequency and wavelength marked on the radios. You know that's a good one from long ago, because they moved away from that quite a while ago. And again, remember, the wavelength is how far the radio wave will travel in one complete cycle, and the wavelength is always measured in meters. And there is a relationship between frequency and wavelength. And you can actually express it using a triangle. Speed on the top, that's the speed of light, or 300 million meters per second. Down below here we have the frequency, and over here we have the wavelength. So frequency is in hertz, wavelength is in meters. And to do the conversions, these are the formulas. Frequency equals 300 divided by the wavelength. And in this case, if we take the frequency in megahertz, we don't have to do 300 million. We just go, the frequency in megahertz is equal to the 300 divided by the wavelength in meters. Or vice versa, the wavelength is equal to 300 divided by the frequency in megahertz. Note that frequency and wavelength are inversely proportional. As frequency goes up, wavelength gets smaller. As frequency goes down, wavelength goes longer or larger. So let's try this out here. We'll do some practice questions here in a second, but this is the triangle: speed of light on the top, frequency in megahertz, and wavelength in meters. So here's a starter question for us. As you can go ahead and unmute if you want to answer this. As frequency increases, wavelength will do what?
Decrease.
Decrease, exactly. And so as wavelength increases, frequency decreases. They're inversely proportional. All right, I always thought this was silly, but this is one of the test questions. The proper way to write the abbreviation for megahertz is capital M, capital H, small z. Okay? And the proper way to write kilohertz is small k, capital H, small z. Don't you feel enlightened now? It's true. All right, so let's do together some practice problems. These are conversion problems, metric conversion that we're going to do together. And then we'll do some frequency and wavelength problems as well. So we said that a milliamp is 1,000th of an amp. 1 MA is 1/1000th of an amp. So how many milliamps is 7 amps?
7,000.
He is absolutely correct. 7,000 milliamps makes up 1 amp. And what we are actually doing is moving the decimal point over 3 spaces, from 7 over to the milliamp position. All right, another question. How many kilohertz is an RF signal of 3,500,000 hertz? How would you express it in
35.
kilo? Go ahead.
Would it be 3,500?
It would be 3,500, indeed, because kilohertz, here's one, the thousand, so 3,500 kilohertz is the same as 3,500,000 hertz. All right?
That's also 3.5 gigahertz, right?
No. Well, we're going to get to gigahertz in a minute here, but it would be 3.5 megahertz, not gigahertz.
Oh, megahertz, right,
Yeah,
right.
okay. All right. So how many volts are equal to 3 kilovolts? Think kilobucks.
3,000?
3,000 volts is the same as 3 kV. So we're just doing some conversions here using the metric prefixes. So how many volts are equal to 5 microvolts? Remember, a micro is 1/1,000,000th of a volt.
5 million.
So 5 1/1,000,000ths of a volt, or if you were to write it in decimal notation, it would be 0.000005. If you have to do that all the time, that's why the engineering notation gets handy. All right, what is the equivalent of 1,000 millivolts?
1 volt.
It is. 1,000 millivolts is the same as 1 volt. And an ammeter measures 5,000 milliamperes. How many amps is this?
5 amp.
Some people are right on top of this, and you're absolutely correct. It is 5 amps. If it's not clear to you yet, you can go back over and review, and it'll come clear to you. I'm pretty sure. All right. So a frequency readout shows 7.150 megahertz. What would this be in kilohertz?
7,150?
7,150 kilohertz, correct. That's converting from megahertz to kilohertz. All right, how many microfarads are 5 million picofarads? This is a tough one.
5 microfarads.
And the answer he is correct, because we move over, picofarads are 1,000,000th of a millionth, so you move over 1,000,000, and yes, 5 microfarads is the answer, is the equivalent to 5 million picofarads. Gary, why do we have to measure quantities this small? That's the nature of radio and radio engineering. All right, 21,500 kilohertz is what in megahertz?
21.5.
21.5 is correct. And a frequency readout says 5,125 megahertz. What is this in gigahertz?
$5.125 gigahertz.
It is 5.125 gigahertz is the same as 5,125 megahertz. So doing these conversions is something that we do all the time and something you have to do for the test as well. So let's do some frequency and wavelength problems. Again, we're going back to our triangle. Speed of light on top, 300. Frequency in megahertz down here, and wavelength in meters. So the question is, the frequency is 14.2 megahertz. What is the actual wavelength? And if we're to plug it into our formula, we know that the frequency is 14.2. So we put 14.2 here. We put our thumb over this. This is what we're trying to find. 300 over 14.2, or 300 divided by 14.2. Anybody got a calculator
Somewhere
handy?
about 20.
Say it again.
Somewhere near 20.
Did I hear 220? That's not right.
No, somewhere near 20.
Oh, somewhere near 20, yes, indeed. In fact, if you do the math, it's 21.13 meters. That is the actual wavelength of a 14.2 megahertz signal. So Gary, if you're paying attention, come on back to me here just for a second, if you would. Here's our color chart. You've got one in your book too. And you look in the 20 meter band, 14.2 megahertz is in the 20 meter band. But this says 21.13. What we have here are the approximate wavelengths. These aren't the actual wavelengths. These are close to it. And so just keep that in mind when we talk about the 20 meter band or the 80 meter band or things like that. Those are approximate wavelengths. But this, in this case, is the actual wavelength, 21.13, and we could use that in calculations to build our antenna. We'll talk more about that in the future. But so that's why it comes out that way. All right, here's another one. The wavelength is 10 meters. What is the frequency? So again, we have 10 meters as the wavelength. We have 300 on the top, so we put the 10 over here. And 300 divided by 10 is going to be 30. Again, however, we talk about the 10 meter band, and those frequencies are 28 megahertz. But again, in this case, this is the actual conversion. All right, that was tough, but you did it. Some did it better than others, but that's fine. This is a learning process. Don't expect perfection of yourself. That's not necessary. What you're doing is learning new concepts, new ideas, and you're stretching your brain, and it'll come clear here. But here are some actual test questions from the actual tests that you will take, and these are the actual answers you will see. So let's see how we do with these. So what is the relationship between wavelength and frequency?
B.
Wavelength gets shorter as frequency increases. That is absolutely correct. They're inversely related. All right. What is the formula for converting frequency to approximate wavelength in meters? Remember our pyramid. What's on top of the pyramid?
300.
300, and 300 is always being divided by something.
D, isn't it?
So it is, in this case, yes, it's D. So the wavelength in meters equals 300 divided by the frequency in megahertz. In addition to frequency, which of the following is used to identify amateur radio bands?
D.
A.
A.
It is A. That's the color chart. We have the approximate wavelength in meters. We have the 10 meter band. We have the 20 meter band. We have the 80 meter band. And what frequency range is referred to as VHF?
Bravo.
So he says bravo, and he is correct. I just want you to note here 30 to 300 megahertz. That is correct. VHF is where the FM radio band is, for example, so around 100 megahertz, so that fits right in here. Note up here, one of the distractor answers has kilohertz. Don't get the wrong one. But 3 to 30 megahertz is correct.
The national calling frequency on 2 meters is 146.520, I think it is. So I just look for something around 150.
Absolutely. The 2 meter calling frequency for FM, as he mentioned, is 146.52 megahertz. Good one. So what frequency range is referred to as UHF?
Well, that's delta.
Yeah, that's above VHF, so it starts where VHF leaves off, so 300 to 3,000 megahertz. And what frequency range is referred to as HF?
Bravo. Sorry, Charlie.
Charlie, yes indeed. That's below VHF, so it's 3 to 30 megahertz. And what is the approximate velocity of a radio wave in free space?
Bravo.
Remember, 300 million meters per second, the speed of light. Radio waves travel at the speed of light. And what is the unit of frequency? Think Heinrich.
Alpha.
Heinrich Hertz, the German physicist. So we have 100 megahertz. That's the base unit. And what describes the number of times per second that an alternating current makes a complete cycle? What do we call that?
C.
Not C,
Delta.
delta. The number of times it alternates is the frequency. Wavelength is how far it travels during one cycle. So here we go again. How many milliamperes is 1.5 amps?
1,500.
So a milliampere is a thousandth of an ampere. So
C.
to make up 1.5, yeah, it's going to be C, 1,500 milliamperes. And which is equal to 1,500,000 hertz?
Bravo.
Not Bravo.
A.
A.
Alpha.
Yeah, 1,500 kilohertz is the equivalent to 1,500,000 hertz. And which is equal to 1 kilovolt?
Charlie.
Yep, think of my kilobucks, $1,000 bill over there. 1,000 volts is a kilovolt, yeah. And which is equal to 1 microvolt?
Alpha.
Yeah, micro is 1/1,000,000th of a volt. And which is equal to 500 milliwatts?
Bravo.
500 milliwatts is the same as a half of an amp, or 0.5 watts. Sorry, watts is the unit. So which is equal to 3,000 milliamperes?
Three amps.
Indeed. 3,000 of the units that are a thousandth of an amp, so in this case, yeah, 3 amps is the same as 3,000 milliamperes. And which is equal to 3.525 megahertz?
Charlie.
Charlie.
Charlie is correct, 3,525 kilohertz. And which is equal to 1 million picofarads?
Bravo.
We used to call picofarads microfarads, so 1 million of them is the same as 1 microfarad, yes indeed. And which is equal to 28,400 kilohertz?
Alpha.
No. Look at the units. Almost.
Oh, yeah. Delta.
Delta, 28.4 megahertz is the same as 28,400 kilohertz. And which is equal to 2,425 megahertz?
Charlie.
Charlie, indeed, 2.425 gigahertz. They're the same, just different ways of expressing it. All right, I didn't specifically mention this, but I think you can probably puzzle this one out. What does the abbreviation RF mean?
Alpha.
Radio frequency signals of all types are called RF. We have RF emissions, for example, transmissions. And what is the abbreviation, the proper way to write it for megahertz?
Delta.
Capital M, capital H, small z. Yep. And the proper abbreviation for kilohertz?
Also
Delta.
delta.
Also delta, small k, capital H, small z. So you're doing fine. There's a lot of information here. Go back and please reread the stuff in the book to help clarify. And if you've got questions or whatnot, contact me and I'll be happy to work through things. We kind of went kind of fast on a lot of those, but it'll come clear. Count on it, okay? So let's move on to section 2.2, Radio Equipment Basics, a much easier chapter. Come on back to the laptop if you would, Bruce. There's my old radio station at my old house. But an amateur radio station is essentially this block diagram. You have a transmitter, you have a receiver, you have a transmit-receive switch that goes out to an antenna. And this is a basic amateur radio station. Transmitter, receiver, a TR switch, and an antenna. And back in the days when I was a young ham, these were the radios that I lusted after. The Kenwood twins. The R for the receiver and T for the matching transmitter. You actually had two different units that had, one of them had a built-in transmit-receive switch that you could route your antenna to. Oh, that was the dream team. Well, nowadays finding separates like this, separate receiver, separate transmitter, is difficult. You might find some old units at Hamfest, but in modern days, we don't have separate receivers and transmitters. We have transceivers. Transceivers combine the functions of both of those and have a TR switch built into them as well. And so here's our transceiver at the heart of our radio station. We have a power supply. A lot of ham radios are 13.8 volt powered radios or automotive style radio power with a Morse code key to send Morse code or a microphone to talk into. A speaker to listen to signals or headphones. These are all input-output devices. And you may also have a power amplifier. Amateur radio operators are allowed to, on certain bands and frequencies, up to 1,500 watts of output power. As a technician class license, when you get your license for frequencies on the 6-meter bands and higher in frequency, you will be allowed to operate with 1,500 watts. On the lower HF or high frequency bands, there are some restrictions and you're limited to 200 watts. We'll talk more about that. Another reason to upgrade. So here's the transceiver that you might want, the ICOM 7851. If you like to push buttons or turn knobs like I do, this is a good one, but it'll set you back about $13,000. So you might want to think twice about it, but they're out there. So as I mentioned, this was my old ham shack at my old location, but let me show you my new ham shack here in Anderson County. And this is an overview of my office inside with an operating position for high frequency on the left and the operating position for VHF, UHF there on the right. And if we look a little closer, I have my computer monitors here. My computer is right there. And I have a controller here which allows me to control my radio. This is called the Maestro. And my radio is actually not in this room. My radio is actually in a storeroom off of my garage. You'll see that here in a second. Now, this is my high frequency operating position. And then the VHF UHF position here is a radio. It's a Yaesu FT991A and antenna controllers to control the direction of my directional antennas, power supply, power meter here, and a 2-meter amplifier down here. So this is my VHF UHF. I also have an FM radio here for local nets, the 2-meter, 70 centimeter, etc. That's my VHF UHF operating position. I said my radio is out in the storeroom. Yep, this is it. This is my Flex 6600. Which is in this storeroom off my garage, and my RF Kit S 1,500 watt amplifier. And from the amplifier, which is powered by 220 volts, by the way, and that's why the amplifier lives here in the storeroom, because that was the only place I could easily get 220 volts. My antenna cables go out through the wall, and I'm using a garden shed. On top of that, I have a roof tripod. On top of that, I have a directional hex beam antenna for the high frequency bands, and I have a directional 6-meter antennas for the 6-meter 50 megahertz band. And I have some inverted V antennas here that you see the wire going up to the trees. I have a couple of those for the high frequency bands as well. So that's my ham radio station as it sits right now, but this too, this little handy talkie, is in fact a ham radio station. And Bruce, if you come back to me just for a second. So here is the radio that I'm currently recommending for hams as their first radio, the TID Radio H3. This is a ham radio station that you can hold in your hand. Inside it has a receiver. Inside it has a transmitter. It uses only FM, that's the only mode it can transmit in. Inside is a transmit-receive switch, and it comes with an antenna as well, which you can remove and add an external antenna for mobile operation or a longer antenna for greater reach. But this is a ham radio station because it meets these definitions. There's a transmitter, there's a TR switch, and there's a receiver. All of those things are built in. So, different is a radio repeater. So the little radio that we just looked at, the TID radio, VHF and UHF, will transmit an FM signal up to an antenna very high up on a mountain or on a tower, and it's received and then retransmitted by a repeater out on a different frequency. So the repeater has to do the function of receiving and transmitting all at the same time. So in a radio repeater, you replace the TR switch, the transmit receive switch, with a filter arrangement called a duplexer. And the duplexer allows incoming low-level receive signals to come into the receiver, be received, sent over to a transmitter for a new frequency, and back on out of the duplexer out to the antenna. And it looks something like this over here. This is a duplexer for a radio repeater, a VHF repeater. This is what a radio repeater looks like, usually just rack-mounted equipment at a transmitter site, maybe high up on a mountain. All right, are you ready? Here's our big question for section 2.2. Hope you're ready for this one. What is a transceiver?
Alpha.
Alpha.
It is alpha. It is a device that combines a receiver and a transmitter. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of chapter 2. You have completed your first chapter. Maybe a little rough in spots, but we're going to get there, and we'll be covering more of these topics as we go along, and it will become clearer. So this is the portion of the class that I call class chat. Is there anything that anyone would like to talk about that we've covered or that you're interested in?
Yes.
Go ahead.
My question was the word radio. What
I don't see a block diagram with the word radio around it. So I see transceivers, antennas, all kinds of equipment, but you mentioned the radio in a separate building from your station. So I thought the radio and station were synonymous, but they're really not. So what part is the radio?
So the radio, and you can have a radio transmitter, and you can have a radio receiver, and which used to be the way it was in the day. Nowadays we have transceivers, but hams call that their radio. Mine is kind of a unique case in that I didn't have the space or the power in my office where I could co-locate a big conventional radio, so I went the route of controlling the flex radio over my local area network. That's how my signals get out to that radio. In this case, the radio is the transceiver, and this.
I get it.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
I get it. Thank you.
I'm running
Thank
out of
you.
words. Thanks. Anything else?
Yeah,
I had a question.
Please.
Is the memorization of the ham alphabet, like Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, that whole gig, is that part of the test? Do we have to have that down pat as part of?
I don't think it's any of the
Passing.
test questions. I don't believe there's any, but the use of the phonetic alphabet, usually the NATO alphabet is what is commonly used, is encouraged, especially if you're sending messages and you have to spell out words. They want you to spell them out using the standard phonetics because they're the most readily understood, and that way the message gets transmitted as accurately as possible. I don't believe there are any test questions beyond something like that. But when you get on the air, it's important. And remember that English is the language of amateur radio, and even with worldwide communications, if to other countries where people are not native English speakers. So sometimes the only thing that they really know or can capture are those phonetic Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, etc. And so that helps to make the contact, to be able to express your call sign as, in my case, Whiskey 4 Echo Echo Yankee.
so
There's
in
several
the-
letters that sound the same.
Say that again now?
Oh, I was just saying that there's several letters in the English language, of the alphabet that sound so similar, M and N, and other letters like that, that's why it's really important.
Absolutely correct. You're absolutely right. Okay, good.
And that's where niner comes in too, because if we use the word nine in German, that's no.
That's true, and you don't have to go real far afield. You'll still hear some hams with catchy mnemonics of with their call sign and whatnot. It's not great for DXing though, because the other countries don't necessarily understand the cute phrase that you've come up to express your call sign. So.
So the memorization of the phonetic alphabet isn't really.
Well, what I'm telling you is
required
not on the
necessarily?
test beyond what I expressed, that it's encouraged. But when you actually begin operating, you want to know that. So it's
Yeah.
in your own best interest to learn it.
So even though it's not like required on the test, it's within the best interest to actually memorize the
To get comfortable with it,
phonetic
absolutely.
alphabet, so you can actually communicate
Guys,
effectively.
You got it,
I see.
absolutely, yes.
I have a question about the duplexing you were mentioning.
Yes, Andy.
Is there a heterodyne that happens there? Do we?
So
I'm
what
not
he's
sure.
talking about
I
is
don't
the
understand that
mixing
part
of
fully.
signals that might otherwise. Yeah, if the duplexer is not properly adjusted, then yes, you can get interference, you can get desensitizing of the receiver, you can get all sorts of strange things. So you need to use test equipment, spectrum analyzer, signal sweep generator, and actually make sure that the duplexer, it has knobs on the top where you can tune the cavities so that they're dead on, so that the receive signal gets through without any attenuation, and the transmit signal, though, can't interfere with the signal being received. So proper adjustment of the duplexer is critical.
Yeah, that's a black box I'd like to understand a little better.
Sure.
I didn't actually catch the duplexer part when you went through it. What's the duplexer doing?
So that's for a radio repeater. Bruce, if you can go back to the laptop there, that's this device right here. This is what it physically looks like. You see the knobs here? There's a knob, there's a knob. These are the adjustments. These are our cavity filters, and it's used here. Where in this case, you have one antenna, and the antenna is being used to receive. It comes over to the receiver, goes audio-wise over to the transmitter, and back out is RF. So here you have RF coming in at very low level and RF going out at very high level. And without a filter to keep those two signals, for a standard 2-meter repeater, those signals would be 600 kilohertz apart. So the filter has to have.
So how's that different from an amplifier, or is it changing the frequency?
It's not amplifying, rather it's just filtering. It's preventing interference between the two frequencies, the input frequency and the output frequency. Anything
I have
else?
a question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, when did DoD change, or who got there first? I know I'm familiar with S-band, X-band, C-band, L-band, all that. And those overlap these other names that you have, and
Right.
I'm wondering why the difference. Who came up with the nomenclature first, and which branch?
I'm not sure, but we do have amateur allocations in the L band and S band. We use those for satellites as well. So. But it's just the telecommunications nomenclature over the years. I don't know if it came from the military or if it came from the civilian side. I don't know. But that's a good Google thing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I got it. Thanks.
Can I just ask one question about repeaters?
Yes, please.
So who installs and maintains those? Is that just a benevolent ham operator who sets those up? Could you tell me more about that?
Yes, indeed. Usually it's a club, although it could be an individual who has an interest in providing that. And so if somebody says, I'm thinking about, I'd like to put up a VHF or UHF repeater, they will normally, this is the best practice, is to go to the regional repeater authority, which is a group of volunteers. It's not any official organization, and you want to coordinate with this organization saying, I want to put a repeater up in Pickens County, and I want to put it on VHF. And they will give you frequency pairs that are available so that you don't cause interference to other radio repeaters nearby. And so that is what is known as a coordinated repeater. And once you do that, then you can begin the installation of the equipment. Now the repeaters are licensed by the FCC, so you have to go through an application process to get the repeater authorized by the FCC as well. Any last minute by the ways? Well, I appreciate your attention tonight. We don't have a break or anything. We're going to call it a night right now. I want to thank you for your attention and read chapter 3, please, for next week. Until next week, 73 you all. See you then.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.